September 1934. A young man found the remains of a woman in her mid-30s. Her body had washed up on the shores of Lake Erie, a torso with the thighs still attached. Her legs were amputated at the knees. The Cuyahoga County Coroner, A.J. Pierce, noted that a chemical preservation on the skin which had turned it red, tough, and leathery. Through the search, just a few other body parts were found, but her head was never found. The woman was never identified, and soon she was referred to as the Lady of the Lake. It wasn't until 2 years later that this find was included in the official killing total and thus became known as victim number 0. It would be another year before the case began officially in another part of the city that is now the infamous Kingsbury Run. This is the story of the Kingsbury Run murders, also known as the Torso Murders. Hello, I'm Brent, and this is Strange Embers. "13 people were murdered over the course of 4 years, beginning in 1934. All of them decapitated. Most of them while they were still alive. And then the murders ended just as fast as they began. Safety Director Elliot Ness even claimed to have solved the crimes, but no suspect was officially identified, and no one was ever brought to trial. To this day, the Kingsbury Run murders remain one of the most sensational and intriguing unsolved crimes in U.S. history. So Kingsbury Run is a historic riverbed running from the flats, that's an area along the Cuyahoga River near Lake Erie, to about 90th Street. There are train tracks that still run through Kingsbury Run, bordered on the north by Woodland Avenue and on the south by Broadway Avenue. Kingsbury Run is a dark, dreary, and dangerous place in the 1930s. It was considered to be a hobo jungle of that time. And there was an area just to the east of the run that was known as the Roaring Third. It was a police precinct that contained bars, brothels, flop houses, and gambling dens. And this is the setting where the most notorious murder case in Cleveland's history was to unfold. September 1935. 2 teenage boys had discovered the decapitated corpse of a white male at the base of Jackass Hill. That is where East 49th Street dead ends into Kingsbury Run. The body was found naked, except for a pair of socks. He was clean and drained of all of his blood. He had rope burns around both of his wrists. The coroner determined that the cause of death had been the decapitation, and fingerprints identified this victim as Edward Andrassy. He was a 28-year-old white male who frequented the Roaring Third. While the police searched the crime scene, they also discovered a second body nearby that was also decapitated, and it appeared to be covered with the same chemical preservative as the Lady in the Lake had. The body apparently had been dead for at least a couple of weeks, and the 40-year-old white male was never identified. January 1936. A woman discovered parts of a woman's body neatly wrapped in newspaper and packed in 2 half-bushel baskets. The baskets were left alongside the Hart Manufacturing Building on Central Avenue near East 20th Street. The rest of the remains, except the head, were recovered about 10 days later in a nearby vacant lot on Orange Avenue. As with victim number 1 and victim number 2, the cause of death had been decapitation. But in this case, the killer waited for rigor mortis to set in before dismembering the rest of the body. Cleveland police used fingerprints also to identify victim number 3 as Florence Palilio. She was a waitress and a barmaid who at the time of her death resided at East 32nd Street in Carnegie, right on the edge of the Roaring Third. In June of 1936, early one morning in Kingsbury Run, 2 young boys discovered the head of a white male wrapped in a pair of pants close to the East 55th Street Bridge. The next day, Cleveland police found the body of the 20-some-year-old man dumped in front of the Nickel Plate Railroad Police Building. He was also cleaned and drained of blood. The corpse was intact except for the severed head. Pierce, the coroner, again determined the death had been caused by decapitation. In spite of a fresh set of fingerprints and the presence of 6 distinctive tattoos on various parts of the body, police were never able to identify the victim. A plaster reproduction of the man's head, along with a diagram of what the tattoos looked like and the location where they were placed. They were displayed at the Great Lakes Exposition of 1936. More than 100,000 people saw the death mask and the tattoo chart, but the quote-unquote tattooed man was never identified. The original death mask, along with 3 others from the case, are on display at the Cleveland Police Museum still. July 1936. A teenage girl came across the decapitated remains of a 40-year-old white male while she was walking through the woods near Clinton Road and Big Creek. On the near west side of Cleveland, the victim had been dead about 2 months, and his head, as well as a pile of bloody clothing, was found nearby. Judging by the mass quantity of blood that had seeped into the ground, this man had apparently been killed where his body was found at. He was known as victim number 5, and he also was never identified. September 1936. A man tripped over the upper half of a man's torso while trying to hop a train on East 37th Street at Kingsbury Run. Cleveland police searched a nearby pool, which was nothing more than a big open sewer, and they found that the lower half of the torso and parts of both of the legs were found there. Police sent a diver in to make the recovery. The number of onlookers that turned out to watch the grim spectacle was estimated at over 600 people, and the killer may have been among them watching. He would be known as victim number 6. He was in his late 20s, and his cause of death, yet again, was decapitation. Pierce, the coroner, noted that the lack of hesitation marks in the disarticulation of the body indicated a strong, confident killer, of whom was very familiar with human anatomy. The victim died instantly when his head was cut off in one bold, clean stroke, he said. Victim 6 was also never identified. In the fall of 1936, the media frenzy went wild with the 6 brutal killings in 1 year, and the police had nothing. Clues, suspects, they were on a dead-end trail. The Cleveland Press, the Cleveland News, and the Cleveland Plain Dealer all reported almost daily on the killings and the lack of a suspect, and tension was high in Cleveland. People wanted to know who was the quote-unquote mad butcher of Kingsbury Run. And given the amount of pressure from the mayor, the recently appointed safety director, Elliot Ness, got more involved in the case. Coroner Pierce called for what the newspapers dubbed a quote-unquote torso clinic. It was a meeting of the police, the coroner, and other experts to discuss information and to try to profile someone who could be responsible for these gruesome killings. The Cleveland Police Department put detectives Peter Murillo and Martin Zulinski on the case full-time. They moved through the seedy underworld that constituted the Run and the Roaring Third, and they dressed the part to fit in while they were off duty. By the time the case had run its course, the two had interviewed more than 1,500 people, and the department as a whole, more than 5,000. This would be the biggest police investigation in Cleveland history. When the November elections came around again, they returned Mayor Burton as mayor, but Coroner Pierce was replaced by a then young and now legendary Samuel Gerber. Gerber's fierce dedication to medicine, coupled with his law degree, put him at the forefront of the investigation. February of 1937, a man found the upper half of a woman's torso washed up onto the shore east of Broughton. Unlike the previous victims, the cause of death had not been decapitation this time. This time, decapitation had happened after she was already dead. The lower half of her torso washed ashore 3 months later at about East 30th Street. The woman was in her mid-30s, and she also was never identified. In June 1937, a teenage boy discovered a human skull under the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. Next to it was a burlap bag containing the skeletal remains of what turned out to be a petite black woman about 40 years old. Dental work allowed for the unofficial identification as Rose Wallace of Scoville Avenue. Police followed every lead they had on her, but they led nowhere. July 1937. There were labor problems in the flats in the summer of 1937, and the National Guard had been called in to maintain order. A young guardsman standing watch by the West 3rd Street Bridge saw the first piece of victim number 9, bobbing in the wake of a passing tugboat on the Cuyahoga River. Over the next few days, police recovered the entire body, except for the head. The abdomen had been gutted and the heart ripped out, clearly indicating a new element of viciousness in the killer's approach. The victim was in his mid to late 30s and also was unidentified. April of 1938. A young laborer on his way to work in the flats saw what he thought at first was a dead fish along the banks of the Cuyahoga River. Upon closer inspection, though, it revealed to be the lower half of a woman's leg, the first piece to be found of victim number 10. A month later, police pulled 2 burlap bags out of the river containing parts of the torso and most of the rest of both legs. For the first time, Coroner Gerber detected drugs in the system. So now they were looking to see, were drugs used to immobilize victims, or was this particular one an addict? And the answers they were looking for might have come if they could have found the arms as well to look for track marks, but they never did. And she was also never identified. August the 16th, 1938. 3 scrap collectors foraging in a dump at East 9th and Lakeside found the torso of a woman wrapped in a man's double-breasted blue blazer, and then wrapped again in an old quilt. The legs and arms were discovered in a recently constructed makeshift box, wrapped in brown butcher paper and held together with rubber bands. The head had been wrapped in a similar fashion. Gerber noted that some of the parts looked as if they had been refrigerated. While searching for more pieces, the police discovered the remains of a second body only yards away. These 2 bodies had been placed in a location that was in plain view from Elliot Ness's office window, almost as if they were there to taunt him. Neither victim, number 11 or 12, were ever identified. August 18th, 1938. At around 12:40 a.m., Elliot Ness and a group of 35 police officers and detectives raided the homeless encampments in Kingsbury Run. 11 police cars, 2 police vans, and 3 fire trucks descended on the largest cluster of makeshift shacks where the Cuyahoga River twists behind Public Square. Ness's officers worked their way south through the run, eventually gathering up 63 men, and by dawn the police and firemen searched the deserted shanties for clues. Then, On orders from Safety Director Ness, the shacks were set on fire and burned to the ground. Ness was severely criticized in the press for his actions. The public remained afraid and frustrated, and critics said that the raid would do nothing to solve the murders, and they were right. July 1939. County Sheriff Martin O'Donnell arrested 52-year-old Bohemian bricklayer Frank Dolezal for the murder of Flo Polilio. Dolezal had lived with her for a while, and through some more investigations, it revealed that he had been acquainted with Edward Andrassy and Rose Wallace. His quote-unquote confession turned out to be a bewildered blend of incoherent ramblings and neat, precise details, and sounded almost as if it was coached to be said that way. Before he could go to trial, Dolezal was found dead in his cell. The 5'8" man had hung himself from a hook only 5'7" from the floor. Gerber's autopsy revealed 6 broken ribs, all of which had been obtained while in the sheriff's custody. And to this day, few believe that Frank Dolezal was the actual torso killer. So the Kingsbury Run murders remain one of the most perplexing cases in U.S. history. Rumors have always been around to who might have been the killer. But one thing was very clear. Eliot Ness had a suspect who he believed was undoubtedly the killer. This suspect continued to taunt Ness for years after the killings had stopped. All official police records on this case have been lost, destroyed, or removed. So while this case is officially unsolved, many believe that the identity of the torso murderer of Kingsbury Run has been known since the 1930s. A mysterious Dr. X was investigated by the police and interrogated by Eliot Ness, but no physical evidence was ever found linking him to the crimes. But it's thought that most likely Dr. X was Francis E. Sweeney. He was an intelligent, skilled, and very troubled surgeon who lived near Kingsbury Run. Dr. Sweeney had the surgical know-how as well as the access to facilities ideally suited for dismembering bodies. Despite a week-long interrogation by Eliot Ness and other high-level investigators, Sweeney never confessed to the crimes. However, immediately after Sweeney committed himself to a sanatorium, the murders mysteriously stopped. If you'd like to know more about the torso murders, I'll have links in the description. There are a couple books by Dr. James Battles. One of the books is In the Wake of the Butcher and Three Murder Has No Tongue. There's also a documentary from Mark Wade Stone entitled The 14th Victim, Eliot Ness and the Torso Murders. So be sure to check those out. After finding this story and reading through it and doing some more, looking for more information about this, I did find another article. This came from CBSNews.com. This article was written August the 22nd of 2024. Almost a century after the serial killer known as the Torso Killer struck Cleveland, Ohio, authorities are using DNA testing to identify his victims. The killer, who is also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, murdered and dismembered at least 12 people between 1935 and 1938, according to the Cleveland Police Museum. Many of the victims were decapitated and their heads were never found, making identification of them very difficult. Many of the bodies were rarely found whole, and just 2 of the victims were ever identified. The DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit organization, is now working with the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office to try to identify some of the 10 unidentified victims. 2 bodies have been exhumed. One, which was known as the Tattooed Man, he was one of the most famous victims of the killer. The Tattooed Man was found decapitated near railroad tracks in 1936. His head was found about 1,500 feet away, but no identification was ever made, even though the police fingerprinted him. Images of his tattoos were widely distributed, and 2 of the tattoos had the name Helen and Paul. and the initials WCG. A plaster recreation of his head was made and featured at the Great Lakes Exposition of 1936, but no one was able to help. The second body being exhumed is believed to be the killer's sixth victim, who was found dead on Cleveland's lakefront in the summer of 1938. Both of these bodies are undergoing testing, and the DNA Doe Project said a single donor is currently funding the lab costs, according to the nonprofit. The remains that they're exhuming could be contaminated or degraded because of their age now. But Jennifer Randolph, the executive director of case management and operations for the organization, said that the nonprofit has made positive identification from older remains before. The goal is to develop a DNA profile of the victims, which they can use to start building a family tree and identify others who may have known the person. Quote, "We'll figure out who the DNA relative matches are, we'll build their trees, find those common ancestors, and then, build forward or maybe even look back a little bit to see who the unidentified individual is," end quote, is what Jennifer Randolph said. Quote, "So there could still be living people who know, that these are individuals who are missing from their families, and nobody knew whatever happened to them. And regardless of that piece, especially given how they died, and they deserve the dignity and justice of being memorialized with their names," end quote. So this will be very interesting to see what comes out of this. I'm definitely going to be kind of keeping tabs on this as they do this DNA testing to see what they come up with. And who knows, through that testing, they might be able to find out for sure if Sweeney was actually the killer. Well, that is going to be it for today's episode, everybody. I hope that y'all are liking these more forgotten about cases. If you have any, drop them in the comments, send me an email. As always, thank you for being here. Don't forget to like, subscribe. All that stuff helps. If you're on Apple or Spotify, rate the show. All of that stuff helps. It helps me to be able to keep this thing going. Everybody that's new, welcome here. Everybody that's been here, thank you for still being here. And we'll see you soon. Good night, everybody.